The Subcommittee on Livestock and Foreign Agriculture will now come to order. This morning we have an opportunity to review animal pest and disease prevention response capabilities in the last year's reauthorization of the Farm Bill that we all worked on together. There were some changes, and we think efforts to better assist America's poultry industry. And the purpose of this morning's subcommittee hearing on livestock and foreign agriculture is, in fact, to determine how those changes are coming forth. So I want to thank our witnesses today for joining us to review the challenges that America faces, American agriculture, by animal pests and diseases, and the ability for the United States Department of Agriculture to control those challenges. It's an important topic that many of us have followed these issues on behalf of farmers and ranchers throughout the country, certainly in my district. And we in this subcommittee take responsibility to oversee the United States Department of Agriculture's response to outbreaks that occur nationwide. And obviously we take that role very seriously. The livestock and poultry farmers throughout America are facing difficult times for a number of reasons. Obviously, the trade wars are having their impact and challenging markets. But some have even been faced with issues of natural disasters, of floods and other kinds of impacts that they are facing. The last thing we need to do, then, therefore, is to have to deal with another devastating animal disease outbreak. Clearly, that is something that we want to prevent at all possible costs. The USDA, Aphids veterinarian services have traditionally and today play a critical role, working with a host of stakeholders in preventing and monitoring and responding to disease outbreaks, whether we're talking about livestock operations, large or small, are a part of this effort. So I'm glad that we have Undersecretary Greg Ibach and Dr. Burke Healy with the committee today to testify. As we speak, poultry farmers in California, I can tell you from my own personal experiences, are dealing with a outbreak of virulent Newcastle disease. This Newcastle disease has, since May of 2018, has confirmed by the USDA over 400 cases of this disease, with all but 2 having occurred in California flocks. Last week, I met with an affected egg farmer in my office who told me that they had over 100,000 chickens that had been contacted with the disease. So I think all of us fear that that can spread. Luckily, it was detected, and we were able to stop that in the case of that outbreak in the San Joaquin Valley. The poultry industry knows all too well what happens when a disease gets out of control. Remember, we are only a few years removed from the outbreak of avian influenza that claimed more than 50 million birds, and cost farmers millions of dollars to eradicate in parts of our country. And no, by no means are poultry farmers the only ones at risk. Around the world today, pork producers are concerned about the African swine fever, which has caused the loss of at least 20% of China's hog population, with more likely to come, we believe, based on estimates. That already exacerbates the hobbled demand for U.S. feed grains in that country, which could wreak havoc on the U.S. if it reaches our shores. We're also conscious of the constant calculating threats to cattle and other species like foot and mouth disease, cattle fever tick, screwworm, and others. All of these are potential causes of concern for our livestock industries. As a conferee in the 2018 Farm Bill, it was a priority of mine to make sure that livestock and poultry producers had new tools to prevent these diseases and the right resources to fight them if they ever did. During that process, we've created 2 new programs, and I'm very interested this morning to hear about the efforts to implement these 2 new programs: the National Animal Disease Preparedness and the Response Program, and the National Animal Vaccine and Veterinary and Countermeasures Bank. We reauthorized the National Animal Health Laboratory Network. We think all of these tools are very, very important to ensure that we guard our livestock industries. I'm also proud of the bipartisan House-led effort to secure $300 million in new funding for animal pest and disease prevention control. I want to thank former Chairman Conway and certainly Chairman Peterson and others as we came together in a bipartisan effort to do just that. Today, I look forward to hearing how implementation of this is going on and those other important programs. I'm going to be focused on your timelines in terms of implementation of these efforts within the USDA. I want to hear more on the status of Aphids' efforts to prevent and respond to threats that I've mentioned, as well as many others that keep America's farmers and ranchers up at night. If they keep them up at night, I can assure you they keep members of Congress up at night. So what's the USDA doing on the timelines to implement the changes in last year's Farm Bill? Very simply stated, what are you doing to implement the changes, and what are your timelines? What can you tell the committee this morning? I think that this is critical work. I'm committed to staying in touch with the USDA. We'll use this subcommittee on a bipartisan basis to ensure that we provide the proper oversight for our livestock and poultry sectors to make sure that we get the strategy straight and on the right track and that we support your efforts. So in closing, I'd also like to get any thoughts that you might have with innovations that are taking place in biological technology. I think it shows promise, and certainly, Dr. Healy, I'd like to get your thoughts on what promise it shows and what the USDA is doing in that area of innovation as it relates to biological technology. With that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, distinguished gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Rouser, for any opening remarks that he'd like to make.
Thank you, Chairman Costa, for holding today's hearing to discuss the latest animal health issues affecting our nation's livestock industry and to review the U.S. Department of Agriculture's animal pest and disease programs. This is really a critical topic. I like to say that food security is national security, and there's no question that the animal agriculture sector faces pest and disease threats capable of devastating the rural economy and our nation's food supply, and I might add our general economy as well. In the lead up to the 2018 Farm Bill, this subcommittee held several hearings to discuss the known and unknown threats against the animal agriculture sector. Largely as a result of the effort of many of us here in the House of Representatives and the body as a whole, along with the hard work by USDA and the livestock industry, we made an historic investment in the tools necessary for USDA and its state government and industry partners to identify, diagnose, and respond to a potential outbreak as part of the 2018 Farm Bill. In addition to the new authorities provided in the Farm Bill, other provisions within the Animal Health Protection Act affords USDA broad authority to detect, control, and eradicate pests and diseases affecting the livestock industry. This robust animal health protection system will continue to be tested, and we must work hard to ensure that we rise to the challenge of combating threats like foot and mouth disease, African swine fever, avian influenza, PDV, and many others. Now, I would like to thank our guests, our witnesses here today, Undersecretary Greg Eyeball and Associate Deputy Administrator Burke Healy, for taking the time to be with us. We look forward to hearing an update on USDA's progress on these Farm Bill implementation issues and your continued efforts to protect America's livestock industry. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, my colleagues. I would like to request that members submit their opening statements for the record so that our witness may begin his testimony to ensure that we have ample time for questions for all of us. So with that, I'd like to welcome the United States Department of Agriculture Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs, Greg Eibach. In this role, the Undersecretary has the oversight for agriculture marketing service and animal and plant health inspection services, which includes, as we noted in our opening statements, the veterinarian services team that we'll be discussing today. I want to thank our witness for being here, and the Undersecretary, as I noted, was accompanied by Dr. Burke Healy, Associate Deputy Administrator for Veterinarian Services for Animal and Plant Health Inspection, otherwise known as Aphid. Dr. Healy has firsthand experience in responding to animal disease outbreaks, and I look forward to his help in responding to questions that we may have to you. So we'll now begin with the testimony. Mr. Secretary, you have 5 minutes. You know the rules here. When the light turns yellow, you've got 1 minute left, and we'd like you to focus on being concise and forthright, and we look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Chairman Costa and Ranking Member Rouser. Also, thank you to Chairman Peterson and Ranking Member Conaway for being here today as well. Thank you for the invitation to be here today to give you an update on USDA's animal health efforts. I am Greg Eibach, the Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs. With me today is Dr. Burke Healy, the Associate Deputy Administrator for Aphids' Veterinary Services Program. All of us have an important mission: to help our farmers and ranchers provide high-quality agricultural products to feed and clothe the world. To do this, we must keep foreign animal pests and diseases out of the country. Because our agricultural products are clean and free of disease, we are able to maintain and expand export markets. Thankfully, USDA has a robust set of tools to fight these pests and diseases that we continually evaluate and strive to enhance. Our authority under the Animal Health Protection Act allows us to create a comprehensive system of overlapping safeguards. Before we allow anything into the country, USDA evaluates the disease risk and designs import protocols backed by the best possible science. The agricultural quarantine inspection officers at U.S. Customs and Border Protection are on the front lines of this prevention effort. They inspect cargo and passengers coming into the country to ensure these import protocols are met. If a pest or disease ever makes it into the country, our surveillance and detection programs allow us to identify it and swiftly begin a targeted containment, control, and eradication response. These tools have served us well. Using them, we've kept serious animal disease threats like foot and mouth disease out of the country for 90 years. Today, the animal disease that currently is most top of mind is African swine fever, or ASF. We have been monitoring outbreaks of ASF in Europe and Asia for a number of years. An outbreak in the U.S. would have severe economic consequences, especially considering there is no vaccine available. While we are confident in the tools we have relied on in the past, I would like to outline several steps we have taken to enhance our safeguards against ASF. Aside from our longstanding import restrictions, we have worked with CBP to focus inspections on cargo and passengers coming from high-risk areas. We are training 60 new detector dog teams that help sniff out any illegally imported products carried by passengers or in cargo. We are working to identify high-risk pathways for illegal products, trace the origin, and shut down those pathways. Simply put, we find smuggled items, including meat and meat products, and take enforcement actions to prevent bad actors from continuing to illegally move product into the United States. We have worked with producer groups and veterinarians to stress the importance of biosecurity measures to protect their animals from outside visitors and to remind them of symptoms to watch for and proper response activities if they suspect an infection. If under some unfortunate circumstance the disease does come in, we'll be ready. We have ramped up our diagnostic capabilities at facilities affiliated with the National Animal Health Laboratory Network. We have reviewed our response plans with our state and industry partners and have tested those plans through exercises. We have more exercises planned in the coming months, which will include international considerations. ASF continues to be a worldwide concern. We have met with and continue to work with our international partners. Just a few weeks ago, I participated in an ASF forum in Ottawa to further our efforts with Canada and Mexico and to establish a coordinated North American approach to ASF. In addition to our ongoing ASF prevention efforts, we are also actively working to combat virulent Newcastle disease in California. I'm sure many of you have been keeping a close eye on those efforts, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Finally, we are very appreciative of the resources provided in the Farm Bill. As you know, the Farm Bill entrusted the Secretary with significant discretion to prioritize funding for what we call the three-legged stool. These three include the Laboratory Network, the Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Program, and the U.S. Vaccine Bank. We're evaluating all the possible implementation options in hopes of designing these programs for long-term success. We have met and continue to meet with interested stakeholders to gain insight and guidance from all segments of the industry to address these various disease concerns. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you or members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you very much, Secretary. I would like to, at this time, defer to the chairman of the committee who has questions, and it's the appropriate protocol. Chairman Peterson, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ibeck, for being here. You know, as you know, we had high-path avian influenza in my district, and we learned some lessons from that, I think, and that's one of the reasons I was such a strong supporter of getting this mandatory money in place so you guys can plan for the future. So in my district, the hog producers are very concerned about this African swine fever issue, and you know, I brought this up last week, and I appreciate the efforts that you guys are making to control the stuff coming in on the airplanes and so forth. But what I'm wondering is, I've heard there's a lot of research going into finding a vaccine, and that's underway as I understand it. But what other research or work are you doing in USDA to try to figure out how to control this stuff if it ever does get into the country and take a hold here? And what kind of work are you doing to understand how the virus moves from herd to herd, and how to clean up infected sites and all of those issues that we learned about with the high path? You know, so I would assume the Chinese are dealing with this, you know, so I just kind of wonder where you guys are at and what your strategy is to put this together so that we're ready if, God forbid, this ever ends up in the United States.
So you're correct that there is a lot of research being done on all kinds of fronts with African swine fever. African swine fever has proven to be a tough disease to find a cure for or a vaccine for, and even to understand completely how we can decontaminate or disinfect a premises once it becomes present in that building or facility. On the vaccine side of things, we still believe we may be as long as 8 years from finding a vaccine that's effective. We're working on diagnostics right now in cooperation with Canada through ARS research to try to have different tools available to us to determine if the disease is present in a population. Just as you mentioned with high-path avian influenza, we learned at that time that biosecurity measures were key. And even though we thought we had good biosecurity measures in place, we learned as the disease progressed, that maybe we didn't have quite the stringent measures that we needed to have in place. And so that's one thing that we hope we learn from that experience that we're sharing with the swine industry and trying to work through at this time to make sure not only we have those biosecurity measures in place at the border, but that we're also working with individual swine producers across our country to make sure they're thinking about how they're protecting themselves from exposure from outside visitors that could bring the disease into their operations.
Are they, engaged in this all across the whole industry? I mean, are they really paying attention at the individual producer level? One of the things we found out with the high-path avian issue, we had, like on a whole bunch of people staying in one hotel or in one apartment building that were working at 5 different farms. And they were coming in and spreading this stuff, coming in at night and so forth and going back out. Is that kind of thing on the radar screen of the hog producers? Are they being informed about this, and is there industry focused on it?
Yeah, we're working very closely with the industry. I probably speak almost personally once a week with either a leader at MPPC or one of their veterinarians on staff there. We continue to try to talk about all kinds of measures that we will take if the disease does become diagnosed here in the U.S. And so I think that we are very focused. The swine industry is very aware of the devastating economic impact it could have not only on individual producers but on their industry as a whole. And our economy would feel it if we had a widespread disease here in the U.S. So I feel we are very focused on communication and working together.
Well, thank you, and thank you for what you're doing to put this together. I think you've kind of got it on the fast track, and hopefully nothing will come of it, but we're going to try to be ready in case something does. So thank you for your service.
Thank you.
I want to thank Chairman Peterson for his focus and his efforts on behalf of this subcommittee and all the subcommittees within our House Agriculture Committee. Congressman Rouser and I both, as I noted earlier, respect protocol, and wanted to therefore defer to the ranking member of the House Ag Committee, Congressman Conway.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I appreciate you not saying you respect age or old age or whatever it is. A little politely. Greg, the veterinarians are a key part of everything that we do, particularly in rural America. There is a shortage of livestock veterinarians that practice. I mean, we've got some 43 counties in Texas that don't have a veterinarian. Most of those are in South and West Texas. We've got 6,600 veterinarians in Texas, and 180 of them practice in the livestock business. And so a little shout out to Texas Tech University for fighting their way through the legislative process to establish a large animal vet program there at Texas Tech to begin to try to meet some of these shortages. Are you seeing this same trend in other states besides Texas? And then also, what are the implications for local economies, animal health, and public safety if we don't have a requisite number of doctors who are veterinarians who will service livestock?
As Director of Ag in Nebraska, previous to coming to USDA, the shortage of large animal veterinarians was not lost on me in that position. In fact, we utilized some of the programs that Congress had authorized to be able to recruit and retain large animal veterinarians. I also think that the part of the shortage is that being a large animal veterinarian puts you at odds with the elements in some of your practice at times. And some of the, as vet schools screen students to come into vet school, I think sometimes the students that are happy to be out on a ranch in blizzards or in cold weather or rain, sleet, and snow aren't the same students that are going to score a perfect score in organic chemistry or some of those disciplines that I think have gained more emphasis as in the selection process. And so I think in order to also help address the problem, not only the programs that Congress has authorized, but also an emphasis on aligning and selecting students that want to really be large animal veterinarians is important.
So in Texas, I'm a CPA, and we periodically go through, and the profession itself goes through an analysis to say, what's that entry-level point? What are those qualifications? What are those deals that qualify folks? Is there a similar process for veterinarian writ large across the United States that would look at those standards as to what really is necessary to get somebody into vet school?
I think there's a lot of variation between vet schools. Obviously, Texas Tech has taken a focus and looked at large animal as a specific need and sought to prioritize that. I think in other areas of the country where small animals or urban areas where small animal practices are important too, maybe that same focus isn't in place. But I think that we need to look at the supply and demand of each category of veterinarian and try to see how we best meet that.
I appreciate that. Back on the African swine fever and the vectors by which it gets here, I understand we import a significant amount of organic feed from China. If that feed goes through some sort of irradiation process, does that change the standard of organics? And what are we doing reference vectors other than meat that might be bringing that disease to us?
So organic feed and soybeans specifically has been an issue or an area of concern for quite a while. And so I actually on the AMS side have access to looking at those numbers of imports of organic products. And we've seen a real a downturn in the amount of organic products coming from China, especially in the feed grain side of and oilseed side of things. That's something that we also are working very closely with the pork industry on their concerns over that as well. And we had them in a few months ago and actually talked about 17 different areas of concern. Feed was one of them. As we look at trying to address the concerns in feed, we don't have the same science to analyze the risk there that we have in some of the other vectors that we are seeking to control. And the swine industry is highly dependent on some imports from China, especially in the micronutrient area, and so shutting down all imports of feed would actually hurt the swine industry. So we've agreed to work very closely with them on research to try to determine what, if we did take measures to address the concerns there, would actually be based in science, and what actions we would take that would make a difference. And at this time, in agreement with the swine industry, we haven't taken any additional steps.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Mr. Chairman, you go back.
All right, gentleman yields back. As I said in my opening comments, one of the focuses this morning I wanted to do is to see where you are in terms of getting the programs up and running as soon as possible. Can you tell us what the timeline currently is with the National Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Program, as well as the National Animal Vaccine and Veterinarian Countermeasures Bank?
So we believe at USDA that all three legs of the stool are important and play a role in the steps we're taking.
No, I know you said that, but what's the timeline?
And so we are prepared to be able to meet our expectations to invest at least the first $5 million in the preparedness effort before the end of the year. We're meeting regularly with not only the
How about the Countermeasures Bank?
The Countermeasures Bank, that's what we're meeting with poultry as well as swine and beef to understand how we might balance that.
You don't have a timeline there yet?
We hope by the end of the year we might be prepared to advertise or put out a RFP to
And
get
then what
bids
the
on
changes
vaccines.
that have been made to the National Animal Health Laboratory Network in the Farm Bill last year, where are you in terms of implementing those changes?
So we continue to invest money in the laboratory network. Most recently, we invested money to be able to increase the capability of that lab network to test for African swine fever, and we're going to continue to evaluate where we can bolster that network.
Well, I think many of us are hearing different things from the industry folks that are dependent upon that. What alarms me, Mr. Secretary, is that the President's budget request for Aphid in the fiscal year 2020 does not show any overall increase in spending for the 2018 levels. That would be difficult enough, but in fact, it proposes to cut the National Animal Health Laboratory Network as well as other key programs within your budget. The point of these new authorities and funding was not to reduce the funding in existing areas or to replace your current work. So I guess I'm looking, and I think members of the subcommittee, what assurances you can give me that the new mandatory money you're getting from the Farm Bill will actually be used to improve our preparedness and response capabilities and not offset budget cuts in other areas. You know, you've been around long enough to know the President proposes and the Congress disposes. So we're working on the budget, but I hope that we're going to have a budget that allows you to implement the changes.
As a livestock producer myself and a beef producer, I understand the importance of animal health at a producer level as well as at a regulatory level. We look forward at APHIS to being wise stewards of whatever.
No, I understand that, but I mean,
Congress makes.
and you're representing the administration. I get that, but the bottom line is I certainly don't expect you to do more with less. That wasn't why we made the changes last year.
I understand that, sir.
And those are the things we're going to keep coming back to you on this to see how that's going. Let me get a little local here. As I noted, we had the egg producers in here last week. Some folks got some nice omelets, I think. But one of my local producers complimented the USDA in response to the outbreak, but they were frustrated that in terms of the indemnities because of the avian flu losses that we had in California, that they were based on prices that didn't reflect the markets in California. Which were higher in terms of the reimbursement rates. Is there some way to make sure that indemnities better match market values?
That's one of our constant struggles, and the indemnities is something that we've worked on to try to make them appropriate without making them attractive to have animals brought in to be able to take advantage of the indemnity. You know, when we look at production birds versus some of the exhibition birds that we're looking at, there can be a wide range in what producers deem the value of those birds to be.
No, I understand there's a dispute, but obviously we would like you to work that out and so that the indemnity reimbursement is fair and equitable based upon regional markets, and that's the question there. I've also got a question with regards to foot and mouth disease, which is a huge concern for cattle, sheep, and pork. The recent Government Accountability Office made many recommendations on how USDA could improve your preparedness. What actions have you taken?
To improve preparedness against foot and mouth disease?
Right.
I think that that's part of what we're ever looking at the border, how we work with CBP to identify countries that are of greater risk at perhaps being a vector for it to come into the United States.
Chairman Peterson asked if I would yield, and I will obviously always honor the chairman's request.
Just 10 seconds. I forgot to, on behalf of Mr. Vela and myself, we've been down looking at fever ticks in Texas. Would you give us an update? I think Mr. Vela sent you a letter, but I'd like an update on what you're doing with fever ticks and how it's going to play into whatever you're doing with this new agency. So,
yeah, fever ticks continue to be a pressure on our southern border, and we've worked very hard to try to maintain that permanent quarantine zone. I'm also pleased to report that with the change of administration in Mexico, I had the opportunity to meet with some of the leadership there, and they pledged support to try to do more on the Mexican side of the border, which would be very helpful if they help push back the fever tick populations from the border with what we want to accomplish there.
Was the gentleman from Minnesota's question answered? Very good. All right. I now would like to yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Congressman from North Carolina, Congressman Rouser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, African swine fever's big topic of concern, certainly in my state of North Carolina. You have a lot of pork production in my neck of the woods. Can you walk us through what would happen if ASF is found in Mexico or Canada? And then follow up to that, do we have a coordinated North American strategy with Mexico and Canada on this issue?
So we're working on laying the groundwork to have a coordinated strategy in place here in North America. We've worked more closely with Canada up to this point in time because of the live animal movement that goes back and forth between Canada and the U.S., but Mexico is also a concern. I think the first thing we would do if a disease was identified in one of those countries is after consultation with the CBO in that country, decide what animal movement we needed to limit or regulate until we were able to determine if they had controlled and contained the spread of the disease in order to protect our U.S. Swine industry.
Do those two countries have the resources? Do they have the apparatus in place to address it adequately, or is it woefully inadequate?
I think Canada has a very similar network in place that we have in the United States. They have been very worried. Their producers have been very worried because the export market is a higher percent of their domestic production even than it is for us. So it's very scary to them, and they have worked very hard to be prepared. Mexico, I know it's on their radar screen, and they participated in the symposium in Canada as well. We aren't as familiar with where they're at, but do have confidence that we would be able to work with them if they did diagnose a disease.
You mentioned exports. Obviously, that's important for us. So hypothetically, worst case scenario, we have an outbreak here in the United States. What do we have in place from a trade perspective in terms of mitigating that trade fallout?
So we are working on a regionalization agreement with Canada right now that would allow us to try to establish regionalization. As you know, in the poultry industry, we have outbreaks of low-path AI that result in trade implications, but because of regionalization agreements, we're able to keep those at the county level in many cases, sometimes at the state level to those export restrictions. We want to be able to establish that with pork as soon as possible. A lot of it will depend on our early diagnosis, our ability to contain the disease, and our ability to assure trading partners that we do understand the nature of the spread of the disease.
Yeah, can you elaborate a little more on the surveillance measures that you have in place, not only for African swine fever, but the other diseases out there? What Aphids is doing in particular in coordination with state governments and private industry and others?
So that is our major focus on surveillance, as well as being alert and vigilant for symptomatic expression of the disease is very much reliant on our state partners. And so we're communicating with them. Part of the hope in the disease preparedness portion of the Farm Bill that the Congress identified is to be able to work even more closely with those state partners to give them more tools to develop a network that we can rely on.
Is there a fairly large discrepancy between the states or disparity between the states in terms of what they have in place, and what are we doing to help equalize that?
I think that the states have worked very hard, especially those states that have large livestock populations that rely on them and are economically dependent on the livestock industry. They've worked very hard to be prepared. USDA has worked very closely with them and continue to communicate with them to help them understand the importance of being prepared. We have had a number of exercises over the past decade, mainly focused on foot and mouth disease, but the principles are the same if we would have another disease. The same type of control and containment measures are universal.
Thank you. Thank you both. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, the gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from New York, Congressmember Brindisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Requirements are adequate to keep the U.S. safe?
I believe so. They are requirements that we have relied on for years and decades, and for 90 years now we've been able to keep foot and mouth disease out of the U.S. using these protocols. In the face of the threat that African swine fever poses right now, we've even raised the protocols and the awareness of the protocols, our coordination with Customs and Border Protection to have them be a full partner with us, I think is at an all-time high, and so we are quite confident yet.
Outside of your testimony, what other types of animal pests or diseases are of current significant concern to USDA?
You know, there is classical swine fever probably wasn't part of my testimony. That's another disease that is prevalent in many countries across the world that we're concerned about. Foot and mouth, of course, is one of the diseases that we're concerned about. PRRS we have here in the United States, but is more prevalent in other countries that we continue to be concerned about as well.
I just want to ask you just about something that is of concern to folks on the East Coast, the longhorned tick. It's an invasive pest from East Asia, has been found in New Jersey and other East Coast states, and as a representative from New York with over 1 million head of cattle, that's very concerning to me as well. The pest reproduces asexually, which makes it particularly concerning to spread rapidly, and according to the literature, it can transmit a wide variety of diseases, especially for cattle. So what's the plan for making sure this tick doesn't become an important U.S. vector of livestock disease?
So I think we have some experience in dealing with ticks from our southern border along Texas, and we'll continue to see whether or not we need to put control measures in place in other portions of the United States to protect against other ticks that could be of interest. There may be an endemic population in some areas already that, and we need to do research to understand the threat that they might pose.
Okay, and I do want to just follow up a little bit on the chairman's questions, because I'm also very concerned about the president's budget request for fiscal year 20, which reduces the activities of the National Animal Health Laboratory Network by over $5 million per year. Just outside my district is Cornell University, which is a level 1 lab located not too far from my district, and they do great work. So with so many diseases of high concern present around the world, why would you request this decrease, especially after Congress strongly supported this function?
I think some of the shift was to be able to make sure we had funds available for the NBAth facility that's being built near Kansas State University. But we also do not take lightly the importance of the lab network and the importance of having the proper diagnostic abilities located in all areas of the United States.
Okay. And just really briefly, can you comment on what you are doing to encourage veterinary workforce training and recruitment in critical fields? Because I'm hearing a lot about shortages throughout the country.
Well, thanks to Congress, USDA has several programs available to it to be able to support especially large animal veterinarians. And we continue to work with states to be able to grant out those dollars and have them be effectively used.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back his time, and the chair will now recognize the Congresswoman from Missouri, Congresswoman Harteller.
Thank you.
Show me state, right?
That's right. Show me state. Appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. And I want to commend you for the new surveillance program for the African swine fever. That's very encouraging and very, very important. And I was interested to hear about the dog teams that you have secured. I was just wondering, how long will it take to get them trained and ready, and when can we expect them at the ports?
So there's several components that go into it. We are acquiring dogs right now. Some of those are shelter dogs, when we can find beagles in those shelters that are of the right age and health status to be able to incorporate into our program. We're also working with Customs and Border Protection to identify the handlers that get trained at the same time as the dogs. And we already have identified some teams to be able to put in place in the training program. And so we will be, as they graduate from that training program, we will be deploying them periodically throughout the next year.
Yeah. How long is the training when they go into training?
6 to 12 months, Burke says.
Okay, very good. So we've heard a lot of discussion here already about the ticks. And this something that is devastating this whole country, but certainly my district, is Lyme's disease. I do believe it's an epidemic, and it's impacting many individuals with long-term health problems, and as well as livestock. So what efforts has USDA found to be successful in controlling tick-borne diseases in animals, and what experience does USDA have to lend to the U.S. as a whole in controlling the spread of Lyme and other tick-borne diseases, including to people?
I might make just a few comments, and then I'll let Dr. Healy maybe go into more depth on this question. But this is one of the cases where Secretary Perdue's One USDA philosophy is very important to us. We work with ARS to understand, and REE to understand the science and have research to be able to base action at APHIS on.
Thank you. As you know, we've done several projects in the past, so cattle fever tick being the most visible one, where that tick was throughout the South and was pushed back to that small strip in Texas. So the challenge that we're having today is the tools that we've used in historically, organophosphates and other types of tools, and coming up with new mechanisms and new tools. And as Undersecretary just identified, we're working with ARS to develop new tools that we can utilize. Some of those are vaccines that we can use. There are novel use of current drugs that are out there that we can utilize, but even going into other types of materials that are not drugs, so essential oils and things of that nature have even shown some benefit. So trying to develop those better tools and tools for the future that aren't going to be challenged through the regulations of EPA and the other types of environmental issues that we can develop.
Great. I have an entrepreneur in Missouri that has developed a nutrition supplement that can be added to feed for deer, domestic deer at this point, and it repels ticks, and he shows a lot of promise there. So I may visit with you back about that, because I think that may be something we can utilize. Just in the minute and a half left, I wanted to switch to the announcement last week that a Chinese firm has entered into a partnership with the UK-based livestock genetics company to bring to Chinese markets gene-edited pigs' resistance to the PRRS virus, and to also develop commercially available African swine fever resistant pigs. And since it's so hard to seek approvals from the FDA, it would place U.S. farmers at enormous risk and disadvantage if other countries can access these innovations, but U.S. producers can't. So can you detail what steps USDA has taken to engage with the FDA to make them aware of the needs of farmers? And has any work been done to try and find a more workable regulatory pathway so our pork producers and farmers have that same opportunity for those perhaps advanced genetics?
I share your concerns that as we see the innovation being identified in many cases here in the U.S. at our research institutions, that we are seeing other countries as offering the pathway to commercialization. Horned dairy cattle are being commercialized in Canada. Brazil and Argentina have both invited in gene editing for projects that they are looking to commercialize. It could put U.S. producers at a disadvantage. At the same time, I think gene editing offers a great opportunity to address some of the consumer concerns we have. If we can eliminate disease through gene editing, we don't have to use antibiotics to treat sick animals. Some of the animal welfare concerns that are up there, if we can if we can suppress sexual maturity so that we can eliminate castration, again, is something that consumers may find of value. So I think that gene editing is something that we do need to work on together with FDA. We've had some very cursory conversations with FDA to see what their vision for their path forward on gene editing is. Perhaps there's an opportunity for us to work together with FDA to find a solution similar to the one we found with cellular protein, where we split that jurisdiction to work together to move it to commercialization faster.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The gentlewoman's time has expired. We thank you for your responses. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from California, my neighbor, Congressman T.J. Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for calling the hearing today, Mr. Undersecretary and Dr. Healy, for being here. And I appreciate the chairman bringing up the concerns of our California egg producers as they deal with the outbreak of Newcastle disease on one side, and then the other point that he brought up, looking for equitable indemnities for lost production. And as you well know, the disease is a major threat to our state's egg producers, and certainly once again want to reiterate the need to prioritize the response for eradicating this disease, and certainly to look for the equitable indemnity payments to better reflect the market value of our California egg prices, and certainly would like to see something, if you had something written about that, to get over to the committee and to our office. And with specific regard to the outbreak in Newcastle disease, I heard during your testimony that the USDA recently tapped $45 million in existing funds to address the disease, particularly in California. And could you tell me just a bit more about how these funds are being used? When do you expect that they'll run out, if they will? And given these new resources, why do we continue to see additional cases of the disease reported weekly?
So Newcastle, in that area of California, the three southern counties that are mainly our focus area, we've had a few outliers, but we've been able to crush those before they spread outside of the areas in Northern California, Utah, and Arizona. But it continues to be a problem in Southern California. We're partnering very closely with the California Department of Agriculture and the state vet. It is a joint project that we're working on together. In 2018, we supported the plan that California had in place to work through the problem, but we were unable to get our arms around it. So last fall, in cooperation with CDFA as well as with the national poultry industry, we determined that a more 2003 modeled program that was used back then when we had the last virulent Newcastle outbreak was appropriate. So we had some funding left in the high path AI category that with the permission of the poultry and national poultry industry, we moved 45 million of those dollars over to Newcastle. And so we've begun a way more aggressive approach to Newcastle. As we've taken that more aggressive approach, we're going to identify more positive flocks. Hopefully, as we identify those flocks and eliminate those flocks as well as depopulate dangerous contact flocks in the area, we'll see those diagnoses go down over time.
Great. And from what I understand is that the current USDA policy for virulent Newcastle disease, it calls for a fallow period with no paid virus elimination funding. And so the question, why would the USDA pay for virus elimination for avian influenza, but not for virulent Newcastle disease?
So I'll ask Dr. Healy to address that question.
So the challenge, as I'm sure you're aware, being from that area, is the neighborhood issue. And so we're finding very dense pockets of backyard birds, commercial birds, et cetera. And the fallow period is the way that virus moves, if we were to clean and disinfect and restock that premise, while the disease is still circulating in the neighborhood, they would reinfect themselves, and we just have a never-ending cycle. So we have to use the fallow period in order to have a break, if you will, in the disease cycle.
Great. And Secretary, you mentioned with Aphids, you use the best available research to guide your decision-making. And can you share just a bit on how Aphids decides what research is done internally, and also share specific ways the agency works with other research areas at USDA as well as universities and other external research organizations?
I'll defer to...
Sure.
So the research that we're doing is collaborative research and bringing in through a variety of cooperative agreements and other mechanisms of that type that reach out to the states and the universities to help assist us with those research protocols.
Well, great. Thank you so much.
All right, the gentleman is yielding his time, and the chair will now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Undersecretary Eibach, it's great to have you here today. In a previous life, I was the Commissioner of Agriculture in Kentucky, and you were in Nebraska, and appreciate your strong ag background and the work you're doing at USDA. In Kentucky, we're a major poultry producer. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this, even in Kentucky, poultry is the largest agriculture crop in Kentucky by far. And all the poultry processors in Kentucky are in my congressional district. When I was Commissioner of Agriculture, we had an issue with disease outbreak in some poultry houses. It was actually West Nile virus outbreak. And we, with the state veterinarian's office, eradicated the birds, and we were successful in the eradication process, obviously, and the disease did not spread. But that's one thing that our producers know, but a lot of Americans don't know, that the prevention of livestock disease outbreaks is one of the biggest roles that USDA and state departments of agriculture play. So to go along with what Congresswoman Hartzler was saying with respect to gene editing and disease-resistant animals, there's been a lot of roadblocks within the FDA from a regulatory standpoint to prevent this or to slow the process down. What are some things that we in Congress can do to get the roadblocks out of the way to where we can progress with this type of technological advancement?
I think you have lots of options available to you in Congress. I know that as far as USDA is concerned, we are very optimistic about what gene editing provides for in animals. Earlier this year, or last year, a year ago in April, actually, the Secretary moved forward with talking about gene editing in plants, where USDA has full regulatory authority. and we announced that as if it was something that could be done through a normal plant breeding process, but we could do it with less generations or without losing yield or other benefits through gene editing, that we were not going to regulate that. And so that's very consistent with the path that much of the Western Hemisphere is using in plant biotechnology, and actually very consistent with where large parts of the Western Hemisphere are landing on animal biotechnology as well.
Outstanding. My next question, I wanted to obviously give a shout out to the one of the livestock diagnostic labs in Kentucky is in my district. Murray State University has the brand new Breathitt laboratory that we're very proud of. I want to mention, as you know, but in the Farm Bill, we included enhanced funding for the National Animal Health Laboratory Network. I just wanted to say in my limited time that I look forward to working with you to see that these labs continue to succeed and stay at the forefront of playing that vital role of livestock disease outbreak. And I didn't know if you had any comments about that or anything that we can do to further ensure that these livestock diagnostic labs continue to exist and play the vital role that they serve in agriculture.
You know, as Director of Agriculture, again, I had the experience of working with USDA cooperatively to make sure that, you know, our lab in Nebraska was successful. But I also think it's important that we have the capability to match the species that are prevalent in the different states across the United States. Not every lab needs to be able to do every test, but we need to have the capability to match up with the threat as well as the workload or species load that might be prevalent. I think that's part of the reason why as we evaluate the three legs of the stool and how to divide those investments between, there are competing priorities. There's also the need to be able to spread that initial investment that Congress made available over the first 4 years of the program and not exhaust it at the beginning and be responsible with that. So we are working very closely with industry, with universities to be able to understand how we make the right division of that funding to be able to have the greatest impact.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your good work, Mr. Undersecretary. We look forward to working with you in the future. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Congresswoman Craig.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Undersecretary Ibach, for being here today, and thank you to the chairman and the ranking member for holding this hearing. The livestock industry is obviously incredibly important to the economy of greater Minnesota, and obviously it's inextricably tied to animal health and disease prevention. In Minnesota, we rank #1 in the nation for turkey production and #2 in the nation for hog production. Thankfully, this committee demonstrated a commitment to animal health in the 2018 Farm Bill, and I look forward to hearing about your agency's plan to fully implement those programs in a timely manner. Mr. Ibach, as you know, in 2014 and 2015, high pathogenic avian influenza wreaked havoc on Minnesota poultry, resulting in the loss of over 9 million birds in Minnesota. The losses in birds, coupled with the impact on food processors, truckers, and consumers, totaled an estimated loss of $3.3 billion in economy-wide. What is your agency doing to prevent a similar outbreak in the future, and how do you work with relevant state and industry partners? What lessons learned would you share with producers to improve biosecurity, as you mentioned in your testimony?
Yes, I think that that was unfortunately a great opportunity for not only USDA and states to learn a lot about animal disease outbreak, but try to learn from it as well. And so we have worked very closely with the poultry industry to help them understand the risk factors that may be contributed to the outbreak and the spread, the rapid spread of it, and try to help them understand and work with us as we try to help them increase biosecurity and prevention measures.
Thank you. To shift to swine for just a moment, we all know that African swine fever continues to be an imminent threat, especially of concern to my pork producers. Obviously, it would be devastating to the economy if it arrived in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing abroad to work with China and address their likely underreporting of ASF, and how could this impact the global management of the disease?
So as far as working with China, we have offered our Aphis veterinarians, we have international services officers in place in Beijing that do other important work on the import-export endeavors we have there, but we've offered them as technical experts to China. Up to this time, China has not accepted their assistance. We have reached out in Vietnam, and some of the testing that research that we're doing in conjunction with Canada with looking at diagnostics for African swine fever. We're hoping to maybe have the opportunity to field test in cooperation with Vietnam to be able to verify that they're accurate or hone our accuracy of those tests. So we are reaching out and trying to learn from what's going on in China and Vietnam, and have had varying levels of success with that cooperation.
Thank you. Just one final question. Chronic wasting disease. I know it wasn't mentioned in your testimony, but it continues to threaten southeast Minnesota. And frankly, it's just a matter of time until we see it as severely as our neighbors in Wisconsin have. The University of Minnesota continues to be a terrific partner in testing possible cases. Can you quickly comment on the work your agency is doing to contain CWD and prevent the spread into areas like my district in southeastern Minnesota?
So our statutory authority is largely focused on those captive herds, and we just released some protocols that we are to put in place, new protocols to be more responsive in those captive herds. We're also working in cooperation with the greater population to be able to do research to understand the disease better and look for, if not cures, ways to limit the spread of the disease.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back the remainder of her time, and the chair will now recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Congressman Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Undersecretary. It's always good to see you. And, you know, I'm going to start off this conversation about one of my favorite topics, and that's the Silicon Valley of bioagro defense research, which you know as Manhattan, Kansas. And we're so proud of NBAF and what's going on there, that we're on time and on budget, maybe even under budget. So that's exciting. Looking forward to USDA doing a lot of research there. You know, of course, folks back home are concerned about the funding of it. And there's traditional funding through ARS, the cooperative agreement, but we think there's other opportunities as well, collaborative opportunities, leveraging that knowledge. How does USDA see those opportunities beyond the traditional funding?
So actually, we're quite excited about those opportunities as well at USDA. And APHIS and ARS work very closely together with dividing up our animal disease responsibilities in APHIS that occur in NBAF with the research opportunities that ARS is in control of. Actually, tomorrow, Mr. Crosswhite, sitting behind me, is going to go participate in the program that ARS is sponsoring, that we're bringing in biologics companies to understand how the biologics development module can be used to leverage that research to be able to determine how we can move that into commercialization as rapidly as possible. And so we're looking forward to hearing their ideas about how we develop those cooperative ventures to be able to leverage and get the most out of the facility.
You know, quick follow-up NVAF question. There's still some animal research going to be done at Plum Island. What additional research you think, what differently will we be doing in Manhattan as opposed to Plum Island?
So Manhattan gives us the opportunity to have our first U.S. BSL-4 lab available to us, which means we'll be able to not only work on the important animal diseases that we've been working on, but we'll be able to work on some zoonotic diseases like Ebola that we haven't been able to do as much research on at Plum Island. So we're excited about the opportunities that provides.
Great. Go into my lightning round here. Talk a little bit about the Fmv Vaccine Bank just for a second. March 2019 GAO report stated the USDA will likely face significant challenges in pursuing its response goals of detecting and controlling an FMD quickly. I went through several scenarios with folks back home. It's a tough challenge. So, what would be the plan moving forward to implement the FMD Bank and get us where we need to be?
So we're working right now to evaluate how we might get the most bang for each dollar invested in a vaccine bank. As you know, that vaccine has an expiration date of about 5 years, so we're looking at models that might allow us to be able to purchase and then sell back the vaccine, and we're working with companies to understand that. Actually, not only important is the vaccine, but also disease traceability and understanding and identifying where the disease might originate to be able to control and contain it. And that's somewhere else that we're partnering with Kansas right now on their traceability project to be able to help us.
You're familiar with that. Let's move on to African swine flu virus just for a second. Of course, we're all concerned that we let some type of feed come into our country. That's very upsetting. It would seem to me if it went the opposite way, if we had infected feed come from the United States to other countries like China, they'd probably lock us out of their market. So I hope we have a strong enough response to that. How are we doing on false positive, false negatives for testing, and what are we doing for follow-up on positive samples?
I'll let Dr. Healy answer that question.
So the testing protocols that we've used, we've essentially found 0 false positives in our CSF type test. And the ASF that we're rolling out, that protocol is essentially the very similar protocol, very similar testing. So we don't anticipate enough, or we don't anticipate many of those. If we do find them, then of course we'll follow back up with additional subsequent testing and in that screening test.
Great. Just to move on quickly, the gene editing versus an animal drug remains a big concern to folks in Kansas. I associate myself with remarks made by Congressman Hartzler, Mr. Comer as well. You've already answered that, but I just can't tell you that we've only had one food animal gene editing situation approved so far, so they're not responding to our needs. Something different has to happen. I think that USDA is probably the place. I don't think that gene editing is an animal drug. And finally, I have a question I want to submit for the record for the veterinarian biologics regarding funding, adequate funding for that research projects as well. Thank you for having me, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair will now recognize the gentleman from one of the nice parts of California on the Central Coast, Congressman Carbajal from Santa Barbara.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ibeck, as we've seen in recent months, disruption in vital export markets have caused American farmers, including farmers on the Central Coast that I represent, severe economic drawbacks that may continue to do harm to our agricultural economy for years to come. Undersecretary Ibeck, you said that part of your mission is to protect and preserve open markets for U.S. agriculture products. Given the negative impact that the President's trade war is having on American farmers, keeping markets open is very important. What are the current priorities for Aphids to help facilitate trade for U.S. farmers and ranchers?
So Aphids' responsibilities in trade are largely focused around the phytosanitary and sanitary restrictions and agreements we enter into with other countries around the world. As we've seen the difficulties with China emerge and remain in place, we've looked for opportunities to reach out to other countries around the world to be able to break down those sanitary and phytosanitary barriers and create new markets in other countries.
Do you find that we're being successful?
Yes, we're having some luck. We're making real advancements on the PPQ side, the plant side, not necessarily the subject of today's hearing, but we are making progress with many different products.
Great. In your testimony, you highlighted multiple instances when Aphids Animal Health Functions was successful in combating potentially devastating disease from either spreading or entering the United States. Aphids' role in proactively monitoring animal health across the world is essential to supporting safe imports and exports. In what ways has Aphids elevated the importance of biosecurity to protect U.S. livestock and the poultry industry?
So you're very correct. We constantly are monitoring disease levels around the world. We do that out of our Fort Collins headquarters facility there. And so as we identify potential threats, we evaluate the risks they pose as far as either trade or travel of commercial passengers. And then we work with Customs and Border Protection to be able to make sure that we have them aware of the risk that we perceive and try to eliminate and combat that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, the gentleman yields back, and the chair will now recognize Congressmember Bacon from the great state of Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just got to point out, Undersecretary Ibach is one of our favorite sons of Nebraska. We're proud of him. We're proud of what you're doing in the administration and how you're serving our country and our agriculture.
I assume you say that as a friend.
As a friend, yes. Then you get ready for the hard question. No. Now, if I may, first of all, I just thank you for your testimony on Asian swine fever and foot and mouth disease. I think they're very informational, especially on the Asian swine fever, that we don't really have a known counter or a vaccine for it. Do you need any more? Do you have adequate research dollars that we can put more towards Asian swine fever, since we don't have anything to counter it right now? Is there anything more that we can give you, or what tools can Congress help you with in this regard?
I think that's one of the things that we're constantly working with ARS to be able to identify those priority items to be able to shift research dollars into. We also work cooperatively with other nations and universities to be able to augment each other's research in those areas. You know, it's a balance of understanding, you know, how many dollars are available, what's the best distribution of those dollars to address all those. Obviously, there's never enough money to fund all the research that's opportunities that are out there, but we seek to find that right balance at USDA.
Is there a higher priority for research right now than Asian swine fever? Just try to get a feel for what other things you're tackling.
I would defer to Dr. Healy on that one.
Certainly with the threat of it across the globe that we're seeing and the recognition that it's a worldwide issue, vaccine is a key concern. The challenge we have is the various types. There's over 20 different types of African swine fever virus out there, and it moves between them. So it's not an easy virus to find a good vaccine for. So that's the big challenge.
Regarding a foot and mouth disease, it also has a lot of different variants. We're much farther along, am I correct, when it comes to identifying a vaccine?
Correct. So we have, in that one, there's multiple different vaccines for each of the various strains. And as was mentioned earlier, we're reaching out to Asia to try to get some of those strains of that virus so that we can determine how that one plays into what's in Europe versus what's in Africa.
You know, I served in the military for about 30 years, and when we look at a new weapon system, we try to project when is the operational date of such a system or a unit. What is the estimated operational date for the foot and mouth disease vaccine bank?
So we already have a North American vaccine bank that is in operation right now that has some vaccines available for us. So today we would have, with a limited outbreak, a vaccine available to us. We hope by the end of this year to be putting out an RFP to be able to start the base for the U.S. One that was funded in the 2018 Farm Bill.
Is there any other tools you need from Congress when it comes to foot and mouth disease? Are we giving you adequate resources?
I think the current disease prevention and surveillance programs that USDA had in place, augmented with the programs that came in the 2018 Farm Bill, give us a great set of tools to be able to invest across the board, and I think they are sufficient at this time.
And just for folks that may not be as familiar with foot and mouth disease, if we did not have the vaccine bank, can you just give our constituents, just an idea, what would be the impact if we had a foot and mouth disease outbreak in our country without a vaccine bank?
So the vaccine bank gives us some great tools. Of course, the impact of foot and mouth disease, if it does present itself in the U.S., is going to be based largely upon, how it presents itself. If it's a single isolated outbreak in a remote portion of the U.S. that we're able to identify and there hasn't been livestock movement, it could be a vaccine would be a great tool to maybe cordon off and keep our risk into a very small area. If it is diagnosed in a sow unit that is sending feeder pigs to multiple states over the course of a week, it could be a very different outbreak to be able to control, contain, and manage and have a very different impact on the livestock industry.
Well, my time's expired, and thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize a good friend and a person who represents that same nice part of California, the Central Coast, Congressman Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this opportunity to question these witnesses, who I also want to thank, who have not only being here, but obviously your preparation in order to be here. Clearly, based on your testimony and your answers, you have done that, and so thank you very much. As the chairman has said, I come from the Central Coast of California, and as far as I know, Santa Barbara is not in the Central Coast. Just let me make that clear, despite what the chairman said. He's being nice to my good friend and my colleague, Salud Carbajal, on that, which we go back and forth. But that kind of, there's a point to me saying that, in the sense that on the Central Coast, obviously, as many of my colleagues know well, it's known as the salad bowl of the world. So we have some livestock, there's no doubt about that, little dairy, some cattle in the southern part, but we have a lot of soft fruits and vegetables. And, as you know, most likely, Mr. Undersecretary, there was an E. coli outbreak in regards to the product that we have on the Central Coast, although that outbreak was not from the Central Coast. It actually took place in Santa Barbara County when they eventually determined where that outbreak was. Yet, when the outbreak happened and when they saw it was affecting outlets, understandably, for safety purposes, the FDA, per the CDC, came down with a blanket exclusion of all romaine right before Thanksgiving, as you remember. Now, obviously, that was an issue because clearly it affects, not just the consumers, it affects the growers and everybody else who works in that chain. And so I know that Aphids has been trying to work on encouraging other countries to deal with regionality, basically trying to make sure that you try to make it as specific as possible when there is an outbreak of disease. And so and I'm going to continue to work on this issue so we can deal with the traceability, and so that obviously with safety being the most important thing, we ensure that there is the appropriate advisory in regards to certain areas and certain food when this does happen. Now, like I said, I know you're dealing with other countries and trying to get them to be as specific as possible when responding to disease outbreaks. And so I was just wondering if you could comment on those efforts and how receptive these other countries have been in regards to the regionalization as a concept. If you could comment on that, Mr. Undersecretary.
Yeah, so you're very correct in mentioning traceability as probably the very foundation of being able to regionalize, being able to protect the outbreak where it occurs and contain that and let other areas of the California or the United States be able to continue to sell into the marketplace. And I think that is our same experience that we're having internationally as well, is that having traceability programs in place, whether they be in the fruit and vegetable industry or, more importantly, in the livestock industry, and for this hearing, has been a challenge for USDA. The poultry and swine industry have been more embracing of traceability, although you know, I've had some meetings with pork packers recently that aren't sure that we have a sufficient traceability reporting timeline in place to be able to really protect them. The beef industry is, you know, my industry that I come from has been slower to embrace traceability, and I'm working very closely with them to be able to provide producer education to help them embrace traceability over time.
Okay. And just briefly, when it comes to, you know, these types of outbreaks, can you just give us an idea of what the USDA is doing when it becomes, what are the initial steps? How does it respond right away when this type of outbreak occurs for this type of disease?
In an animal disease outbreak, USDA would first get on site in cooperation with the state veterinarian to be able to try to determine whether or not the disease is limited to that one farm or operation, or whether or not animal movement has caused it to spread. We'd look at where animals came into that operation from and where they went to be able to determine the scope of where we needed to go next to try to do that. And that would be our very first step, and we would move on from there.
Again, thank you, gentlemen. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back his time, and for the chair's information, I do stand corrected, but where do you believe Central Coast ends on California?
Where the 20th Congressional District ends.
Oh, okay, I got that. I stand corrected. Try not to make that mistake again. All right, the chair will now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Hagedorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Rouser, appreciate your testimony, Undersecretary. Thanks for being here. I represent the southern part of Minnesota, the 1st District, and we heavy livestock production, #2 in the country for hogs, and also have a lot of poultry production, especially turkeys. I guess I'll start there with this Newcastle virus, or whatever you're calling it. It appears to me, based on what was presented, that most of the cases have been found in California, almost all of them. Are they all related at this point to chickens, or do we have turkeys as well? What's the mixture on the cases that you found so far?
So I'll try to characterize that, and then if Burke wants to follow up a little bit, he can do that. But so far, they are all pretty much in backyard flocks in 3 southern counties of California. Those backyard flocks represent exhibition birds, as they're defined by OIE. Many of them are small, but some of them are backyard flocks to have several hundred to low thousands of birds in them as well. We've only had 4 commercial flocks affected by Newcastle so far, and they've been in those 3 counties as well. And so we continue to work very hard to try to contain the disease in that area. That's the reason why when the national poultry industry saw that the measures that we had put in place last summer weren't working to arrest the disease, that we brought more funding in through the high path funding to designate it to that Newcastle effort.
Okay, so your efforts to help prevent it from spreading or letting people know across the country, particularly Minnesota, I take it, you're working with a lot of the producers, but so far you haven't seen anything in the industry, just these kind of backyard cases, is that?
Yeah, we've made the entire industry aware of it. We've also put some movement and even disinfectant protocols in place leaving those counties so that egg and egg products and poultry products that are leaving the infected area pose less risk to the rest of the United States.
Yeah, switching gears over to the African swine fever, I can tell you that the hog producers and farmers in southern Minnesota, they're very concerned, and they appreciate your work. They just want to make sure that we're making sure that you're doing everything possible. I spoke with you just a little bit before the hearing, and You said that you are working across agency lines throughout the entire administration to make sure that you do everything possible to protect our food supply and protect our agricultural interests. In some nations, they're taking a pretty heavy-handed approach against China. I know that from inbound flights to Taiwan, for instance, that people are told that if they have any Chinese pork products or anything of that nature, they get a heavy fine, and that there are public service announcements even on the airlines. Should we be taking some of those types of steps, or what are your thoughts on that?
So we have taken steps to increase the communication to that passenger traffic moving in and out. There is additional signage and announcements that being made at airports to try to encourage those passengers, if they do have prohibited products, to surrender those products at the airport. Also, the dog patrols have been increased. Probably the area that we also have really stepped up in is within Avis. We have a SITSI division that actually goes out into ethnic marketplaces looking for prohibited products. And so we have focused now on looking in those ethnic marketplaces that might be bringing in products from high-risk countries. In some cases, we've identified these products that have been smuggled into the U.S. We then do investigations to figure out how they were smuggled into the U.S. And so some of the announcements that you've heard from Customs and Border Protection about cargoes that have been intercepted that have these prohibited products have been a result of those investigations out into the country and the follow-up from those.
Very quickly, maybe you can answer this for the record. So we obviously don't want it coming directly into the United States, and we work very closely with our trading partners to the north and south, Canada and Mexico. They have some significant hog operations as well. We don't want it there either. We have a relatively porous border, I would say, especially to the south. Would make it much easier to get it in the country. Are we working with our trading partners? And if you don't have time, I don't want to take up the committee's time. Maybe you can answer that for the.
We're working very closely with both Mexico and Canada.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, time has expired, and we have a wonderful arrival of the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Congressman Thompson.
Chairman, thank you so much. You're kind. I appreciate it. I apologize for.
Always glad to have you here.
Well, right on time. Right on time, I guess, from some perspectives, but I wish I could have been here for other questions when I just came from the floor. Mr. Secretary, good to see you. Thank you for your leadership and your service. Much appreciated. A couple items I wanted to touch on. As you know, Section 7209 of the Farm Bill provides high priority status for specific research and extension initiatives, and I was pleased that we were able to get into the Farm Bill designated chronic wasting disease in that Farm Bill that was signed by the President mid-December of just this past year. Can you describe what we can expect with research on this disease?
I will start the answer to that question and let Dr. Healy finish it. But as you know, APHIS's responsibility are focused on those captive herds, and we work closely with their state wildlife agencies on the wild populations. We recently released some new protocols for those captive herds that we think are going to help us. Burke will maybe elaborate a little bit on the research that we're doing to try to identify how to maybe, if not find a cure for the disease, at least try to manage the spread of the disease.
So a couple things that we do. One is to build a bank of tissues and materials. So when we have an infected herd, we go through that herd and identify the animals that are positive, negative, and collect tissues from all them, establish that bank, and make that available to researchers so they can come in and ask for that material, and they actually know that they're looking at lymph nodes or blood or whatnot from an infected animal versus exposed animals, et cetera. Additionally to that, we're working with the industry to come up with other techniques to try to prohibit the disease and learn about the disease. There's some disease resistance in genotypes and things of that nature that show some promise. Right now it's more in whitetail. We're also looking at live animal testing and other mechanisms and more rapid testing. So a variety of diagnostics and hopefully developing eventually genetics and some prevention techniques as well.
Very good. I appreciate that. Certainly my priorities, and for those who don't know, obviously this impacts cervids, and that includes, it's not limited to, but certainly in Pennsylvania, it includes our white-tailed deer population and our elk herd, and really can be devastating economically, and not just to our deer farms, but obviously to our wild herd. So a couple of my priorities I'd like to see us just keep in mind. You've already kind of mentioned them, and Dr. Healy, in your testimony, one is that we need to come up with a live test. It's unacceptable to me that we suspect one animal is sick. Now this is, well, whether this is in a deer farm or quite frankly in a wild deer population. And there's a couple hot spots in Pennsylvania right now, Bedford County, and I think up in part of my district in Clearfield County. The fact that we call a herd and then we test them and find that most of the ones, thankfully, were not sick. Unfortunately, they're all dead because of in calling the herd. And so a live test, I think, would be just a tremendous service for both. And then, of course, some type of, as you had mentioned, whether some way, obviously in the deer farms, inoculation, but in the wild, perhaps feed distribution or something to be able to address that proactively. We do have a Chronic Wasting Disease Research Act, a bill that I introduced here. It's got great bipartisan support, and we're hoping to build that basically to provide I think it's like $15 million towards research, so we can look at all aspects of the disease. Undersecretary, thank you again for coming to Harrisburg last year in the middle of the beginning of January, when it's always not necessarily warm and balmy.
That was a really cold day.
That was a really cold day. And that's for our annual Farm Show listening session. It was great having you there. Actually, your presence there was so monumental in terms of having us, because since that session, we've seen additional resources from USDA to help Pennsylvania deal with the spotted lanternfly, which is just devastating to fruit trees, grapes, hardwoods. Do you have any update on USDA's efforts to help suppress this particular invasive species?
We're continuing our partnership and working with Secretary Redding. Are you Commissioner, Secretary, or Director? I can't remember in Pennsylvania. Secretary Redding, to be able to invest some additional USDA funds. Kevin Shea, the administrator for Aphids, was up with Mr. Secretary Redding as we kicked off this year's efforts, and so we continue to want to work cooperatively with Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Well, we thank you and for your contributions, and the gentleman's time has expired. And now, before we adjourn, I want to recognize the ranking member for any closing remarks that he may want to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing, and really enjoy working with you on these issues. And I really appreciate our two witnesses for being here today. This is a really, really important topic, disease prevention and surveillance. And I can't tell you how important it is from the standpoint of my constituents back home. Of course, you readily know that and understand the importance to our agriculture sector. And as I said during the course of my opening statement, food security is national security. It all goes hand in hand. So thank you for being here. Appreciate your testimony and answering the questions the way you did. Very informative. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, I want to thank the ranking member for the contributions that he has made, and staff, both the minority staff and the majority staff of the subcommittee, for the good work they've done. Mr. Secretary and Doctor, I want to thank you for your testimony today. I do want to note, as we discussed in a lot of questions that were asked by the subcommittee members in terms of the USDA's preparedness, that while the $5 million for the implementation of the National Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Program and your goal to have that implemented by the end of this year, I think is positive. We're going to stay on you on that because we think it's important. That's why we did that. I'm still not really satisfied, frankly, with the answer or the vagueness of the answer on the National Animal Vaccine and Veterinarian Countermeasures Bank, and we will follow up there. And as we noted earlier, the President's budget as proposed, I don't think is going to allow you to do what we've tried to change in last year's Farm Bill. And so hopefully the Congress will come together in a bipartisan budget that we ultimately send to the President that will give you the resources to do what I think is needed for America's agricultural industry as we talk about the needs of the livestock industry throughout the country. And of course, they were highlighted here today, and we'll follow up on that. And we wish you the best and continued cooperation by all the members of the subcommittee. When we work together, we get things done on behalf of American agriculture. Please give Secretary Perdue our regards, and we look forward to continuing this work. The subcommittee's hearing now is adjourned. Thank you all. Yes.
I'll see you, Joe.
Okay. Let me note with the expression of the members, I know I adjourned, but under the rules of the committee, the chair will recognize today's hearing will remain open for 10 days, 10 calendar days to receive any additional material and supplement written responses from witnesses due to any questions posed by a member. This hearing now is adjourned. Thank you.